what are the Black Mirror, if any of you've seen that show, implications of this technology? And of course, how can we use it for good? We're going to talk about information warfare because that's a thing, and how what the role of synthetic models of people play in that. So that's what we're in for today. I hope you're buckled up and ready for to talk in the breakout session afterwards. So I'm going to jump around in time a bit. So be comfortable with time travel here. We're going to jump back and forth as we talk about the progress of this capability over time. So I'm going to first take you to 2017. In that year, I did a speaking tour of Italy. So I was in Bari, Milano, Roma, Firenze, and I was talking about VR, AR, and AI, some of these technologies we're discussing here today. But something had happened recently that caused me to actually do my own sort of informal poll. I actually asked this question every city where I went. Anytime, young people, old people, anybody who I could ask this question to try to understand what people think and which narratives they were subscribing to. So for yourself, if you can think back to 2014, the Ukrainian president was removed from office. Now, was that a coup or was that a revolution? You can write down your answers yourself there. We'll refer back to it in a minute. What's the right answer, right? Well, it turns out there's multiple narratives. And when I was going around Italy asking that question, pretty much, I think 5 to 86% of the people, regardless of age, it was a coup. It was a Western-backed coup, but that's okay because it was for a good reason. There was this Russian, puppet president in place, and they needed to remove him. So the Western powers, including the U.S., ousted him. And I said, well, that's not our understanding in the Western world. We understand it as a grassroots revolution to remove a corrupt president who, yes, was Russian-backed. But those are two completely different narratives. Real truth, probably something in between. But what I had found out as I asked more questions is people in Italy had been watching news, and I asked them where they get their information, and there's a news channel on the satellite systems there that was backed by the Russian news agencies, and that's where they're getting information in Italian. Now, where's the corresponding American or Western channel? That different story. Well, at that time, especially back in 2014, 15, even 16, we were still too squeamish about this idea of propaganda, about really getting out there and aggressively promoting a narrative. As a result, we were getting soundly beaten in terms of the hearts and minds of people around some of these issues. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. I was actually on a panel organized by the Undersecretary of Defense there at the Pentagon around this idea of narratives of information warfare and what do we need to do as the Department of Defense and as other government agencies to combat this, because it's clear now, it was clear then in 2017 at this conference where we presented our results together with the RAND Corporation, you see some of the names there, that we can't just sit idly by and let that happen because there's too much at stake. In this case, we were talking about just the sort of feelings that people have towards the West around the world, but we could see that there are aggressive techniques being deployed by people. So we've shown, and we're going to talk about this today, that once again, if I have enough information on anyone, I can actually model them. I can get to the point where I can talk to them. I can ask questions of them. I can see, if I have information about how they made decisions previously, I can put them into a simulation and give them new stimuli, new situations, and see how they're likely to respond. How is Vladimir Putin going to respond to a Biden election, right? We can model that, simulate it, and look at all the various outcomes that might come from that. Getting really interesting. So again, just a little bit about background. What I'm really interested in and what I want to talk to you about today is this accelerating information age that we're in, and this idea that in the 21st century, and this is my kind of thesis statement at the top there, that we all need to be looking at every activity we're doing and also what we're doing with our attention as humans, both on the professional side and the consumer side, and thinking about how much of that should we be turning over to machines and how much should we keep in the human realm. Anybody who gets that balance right is going to prosper and make a lot of progress. Those who don't not only will not be competitive, but will be irrelevant soon. So it's becoming really interesting very fast. So I've written a lot about this in education, healthcare, elsewhere, and we'll go through some of those topics today. So again, a bit more about my background and my team. I think that's important to understand is we have a deep sort of background in computer gaming. So we were building models of synthetic people. Even back in the 90s, you'd make a character, you'd give them some behaviors so that they would react a certain way to the people trying to play the game. The more convincing you could make those characters, the more compelling the gameplay became, and therefore the more money you would. Today, it's at a whole different level. I'll walk through some of that progress. Now, shortly after I was working with the computer games, my company was acquired by the aerospace company, Lockheed Martin. And while there, I created a group called Virtual World Labs, which you see in the lower right there. And we're sort of debuting in 2009 at a big conference talking about all of our AR, VR, and AI capabilities. But one of the things we were doing is modeling simulations of entire countries. So we would model Afghanistan. Now, when we modeled Afghanistan, we wouldn't say, it's sufficient to just say that there's 4 or 5 kinds of people there. Just make, like we say in marketing, some segmentation models. Here's a Sunni, here's a Shia, here's a Coptic Christian, here's a USAID worker, and then have these really simplified models to represent all the views, traditions, values, culture of all the people. Instead, we would make thousands of agent-based models that represent every conceivable, meaningfully different point of view. And then we would do something like say, what if we build a school for girls in Helmand province? Which groups are going to be okay with it? Which groups are going to like it? Which groups are neutral? And which groups are going to be possibly so angry about it, they're going to shoot Malala, they're going to try to burn down the school. And let's be prepared for that and make sure we engage ahead of time with the communication protocols we need to hopefully not have that, or maybe we need to move the school somewhere else. But at least we can simulate and predict how people are likely to feel about the action that we're taking. Think about that, please, and think about all the existential challenges we're having today with COVID, with civil unrest, with here in the United States. And think about if you could just better understand and anticipate how people are going to feel about an action you're taking, you can take some steps to hopefully get better outcomes. So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to jump you back again to 2009. This was a really important year for me. I was on the set of Avatar with James Cameron. I spent some time working with these gentlemen here, Alex Kipman and Jaron Lanier, on the Microsoft Kinect project, where I first learned about the new power of machine learning to train systems. This is another thing that came out that year, and I'm just going to show you this brief little clip around building a synthetic person using the machine learning capability and the tracking capability in the Microsoft Kinect. So. All right, I'm going to cut it off there and move on. But I'll say, first of all, that demo that was created turned out to be complete BS. But it was really compelling to all of us who were watching it and looking at it, thinking about the possibilities of game characters even going beyond just reactive, simple behavior trees, instead having emotions, having sentiment models, being able to interact and talk with characters. And my team had also done some work on the Douglas Adams game Starship Titanic, where we created something called that Douglas Adams called Spooky Talk, where you could actually talk directly to the characters, they would speak back to you. And that was way back in the 90s as well. I think we're getting to the point where this is going to get incredibly interesting very fast, but it goes beyond gaming, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Jumping to today, this just came out recently. It's something we should all be paying attention to if you're not already. This is a request for information from the IRS. What they would like to do is harvest all the data, all of us there on ourselves in the United States, and make a sim-like game of the United States. And the stated goal is to make sure they provide better tools, better services that make our tax preparation process more delightful. But you can also imagine all the other implications of having these deep models and what the IRS could potentially do with that, right? So, but this is real. This is happening right now. This is going to be your taxpayer money going towards something that's going to be really deep, really interesting, this synthetic data initiative. So keep an eye on that. So let's talk about how you actually construct these things. We're working together with Delvinia here, who's the host of this summit, on these capabilities, and progress is happening very fast. But this started with us probably 5 years ago, when we realized with our machine learning capability to ingest a lot of information and train systems to whether or fill out forms, process automate, a variety of different things we were doing in knowledge management, we actually realized that harvesting data on people, I can build these models, put them into simulations, really take advantage of all the gaming and simulation work we've done over the years, over the decades, and really do incredibly interesting things with them. And again, like all these, it's a double-edged sword. Can we do good with it? Can we do good with it? How do we do good is what I'm really interested in. But I'd met a couple of folks here. Dr. Richard Carson is sitting below me there from UCal San Diego. Dr. Jordan Louvier, who's the sort of most prolific academic mind around the idea of choice modeling. How do you actually create models of how people make choices, economic choices about where they go on vacation, which car do they buy, which brand of tuna do they buy in the grocery store? We can render all that stuff down to equations and put them in simulations and try to predict how they're going to behave under certain conditions. So that was the beginning of what we call animated personas. And it was also the idea that and we saw that again this election cycle, right? That, if you want to people, you can ask them polls, you can do polls, you can ask them survey questions, but are you going to get to the truth? And it's not that everybody's intentionally lying. And if you've read this book, and I'll just save you from having to read it, the thesis is that, exit polls and surveys didn't predict Donald Trump, they didn't predict Brexit, and Netflix and Google know that if you really want to understand people, you don't ask them questions. You look at what they do with their attention and with their money. Again, this data exhaust they have, the location services, where do they go during the day? How long do they sleep? All that information is left in these little breadcrumbs across the internet, which we can harvest, make these patterns of life into synthetic people, put them into sims and see how they're going to behave. And again, like I said, even when people are trying to tell the truth, it turns out that we humans make poor witnesses to our own narratives, is the way I like to phrase it. So if I ask you, how many glasses of wine did you have last week? How often do you exercise? You might really think you're telling me the truth, but the data will tell a different story. And that's part of why we're using the methods that we are today. So again, what this exercise or practice is one of, sort of combining and fusing a lot of data sources together. So census data, public health survey data, ideally like Nielsen or IRI data around what people are actually doing with their money. Who knows you best? Probably your bank, right? Or Amazon, or like I said, even Google, because Google knows what you do with your attention all day long if you're on the internet. Or Nielsen knows what TV shows you watch and what movies you watch, regardless of what you say. So we know they know who you really are, and there's these models and patterns out there that are being harvested. So once you build these models, and I never say that we can know someone completely, but you can get much, much better and surveys with these models. But if I can get enough data on a person, we started early on doing things like, okay, which people can we find from history that I can, that won't object because they're not here anymore to me gathering a bunch of data about everything they've ever written, and not just, Victor Hugo's novels and poems, but when he wrote private correspondence, love letters, or people wrote to him, or there was there was sort of criticism of him in writings by academic people. I harvest all of that, and I can build very quickly what we initially would just call it an interest graph. What is he interested in? What are the weights behind all these various interests? Maybe even a sentiment model. What is his preference for language? Where is he on the political spectrum? That sort of thing. And I can release that person on the net. We call this the empathy engine. You can actually go there and see, what does Victor Hugo think about what's happening today? Which media sources is he most interested in? And he's actually reading and scoring hundreds of things. He's listening to podcasts. He's watching YouTube videos. And I'm looking at the world through his eyes. So that was interesting. And I can do that with anyone who I have enough information about, right? Then I can do interesting things with them, like very simply, maybe, if you joined IBM or you joined you can maybe select a couple of people who'd worked there previously, or really anyone, like you see the selection of characters I have here. And because I have these interest graphs, sentiment models of them, I could pose questions to them about ideas and have them like agree or not, or disagree, maybe simply. So some very simple Likert scale reactions to help guide me on like, how would these people from their perspective feel about what I'm about to do? If think about the implications in government, if I'm on the city council for a small town and I'm thinking about a school bond referendum and I have models of the major populations of people who live in my community, I could pose an idea and data on, able to see like how they feel about that idea. And know like, okay, I don't need to spend any money over here. These people are already sold on the school bond referendum. I got to go spend some time and attention over with this other group of people and try to move them to where they agree step we strongly believe is important for our community. So think about the implications for education. If I can create these empathy models of people from history, I could allow students to go, and there are people building curricula around these ideas about go and look at what's happening on the net through the eyes of Thurgood Marshall or John von Neumann or Sir Isaac Newton, and they're, ask them questions. Well, I'll get to the questions in a second, but there's a lot of things we can do again around just seeing things from each of their perspectives to understand how they felt at that time, or possibly even how they might feel today about whatever issues I pose to them. Now in marketing, of course, there are some tremendous opportunities and applications where I could potentially do A/B testing of my products or of my advertising or of my emails and messaging, and see in real time. And what you'll see here is I can select a group of people who've been modeled off of data, and I can write to them. And as I make real-time changes to the content, just changing the words, I can get feedback immediately on how they feel about the proposals that I'm making, or the language I'm using, or potentially colors and other stimuli that I'm providing to them. So I'm not having to pull people off the street, which we know the bias issues there and that sort of thing. I could potentially have 126 million models of everyone in the US, so one for every household, and have a point of view against which I'm testing ideas. So really compelling, really interesting, but it all comes down to, can I get enough data? And we certainly know how to do it today. So about a year ago, I started looking at well, I was actually speaking at a Comic-Con in Seattle. Things I did is said, okay, Stan Lee is someone who definitely left a lot of digital exhaust behind, even more than Victor Hugo, potentially, because constantly in the media. He was doing interviews in magazines. He was doing interviews in television, radio. And again, I'm able to harvest all that information. And because questions were asked and he gave responses, that's a nice little lookup table, which can be interpreted by the machine system so that I could actually let the audience ask him questions, right? And he could answer those questions live. I've just described about seeing what he thinks about current events. Also, potentially, who his main sources of information, where is he getting his information? Who are his influencers? But even if I have the sort of location services and some of the other data, I can say, if today is November 12th, what would Stan Lee, if he were still around, likely to be doing today? I mean, course of the day. So think about if you have CRM data around your customers, you would be able to go and see what kinds of things they'd likely to be doing this time of year, but also what's on their mind, what's affecting them, have they changed state? And of course, we know that from a computer sense, all of us have changed state because we're in the middle of this pandemic. Our behaviors are very different from all the research that came before when we were able to move about freely and not wear masks and all of that. So being able to model and simulate these things is incredibly important. So here's just a little video of people asking questions. I'm going to skip past that. I ended up doing also a tour of another continent, South America, in 2018 because of some work I had done. My father died in 2017. Now, he's someone who did not have a big Google footprint. He didn't have a lot of digital exhaust, a lot of data on the net. So I had to do it more like what Ray Kurzweil is trying to do with his father, if you followed any of that, where I had to scan in his military records, his personal correspondence, and then hand build the character that became my father, who I'm able to put back on the net and go visit him every day, which I will say, and the reason I spoke in Buenos Aires and Medellin, Colombia, on this is, South America cultures were very fascinated by this idea of being able to talk and commune with ancestors and actually maybe even pose big life questions to them. I'm thinking about getting married. I want to take this job. I want to move. What do you think, ancestors? And imagine having a panel of your ancestors giving you an opinion on that. But that's not why I did this. I did it as an exercise. But it was also a good spiritual exercise for me in that, like I said, I'm able to go visit him every day, see what he thinks. It's almost like this shadow of him still around. And of course, the deeper I make that model, even though it's hand built from my perspective, I'm able to see what he, I'm able to actually talk to him and ask him questions. Dad, remember that time we went fishing when I was 14, or where we went out on the lake in a boat or whatever? He would, if it's in his memory, he'll be able to remember that and respond to it. That gets incredibly interesting. One of the implications of this, of course, is, when I was at Lockheed Martin, we talked about this idea of the silver. The silver tsunami is all these people who know how the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter works, how the space station works, all these people that are now retiring, taking a lot of information and organizational knowledge with them. What if there was a way to preserve that so that the people that come next can actually commune and get mentorship from these characters who've amassed all of this knowledge in their careers? Lots of interesting positive applications for this capability. And then I want to talk about this because, think about this. I modeled this on my company's technology. He's been living up here since 2017. I can go visit him any day I want. It's been covered in by a lot of different folks who are interested in this idea. I've spoken about it quite a bit. I left this company and no longer here, and someone who stays behind, we're tired of supporting that. Why don't we just delete Richard's dad? Can they do that? And just kill off my dad? What are the implications of that? Once I've resurrected this person and put all that effort and energy into keeping him around, what's the sort of emotional impact of that? Well, if you've ever read any science fiction, I always like to look at science fiction and how it what implications it has for these problems we're looking at. And there's lots of good thought experiments that happen in this in science fiction. But if you read The Hydrogen Sonata by Ian Banks, he talks about this idea of, hey, if you create deep enough simulations of people, essentially you get almost to the point where you have created synthetic life. You've created life. So what sort of moral issues are there, not just in using data about someone who's still alive, but what if you create something that is a different kind of life form? Can you just turn it off without any implications? So that's another thing to think about. We'll talk about in the breakout room. So let's go back to information narratives. And I want to end strong here talking about the existential issues today about COVID and populations of people and our behavior and political elections and civil unrest, all this stuff. So we talked about narratives, in information warfare. Luckily, there are organizations now being stood up like the CCIOS to try to combat these narratives, at least understand what's happening. So we were better prepared in this election than we were in 2016, and yet it continues, it persists. If you've heard of QAnon, if you've heard of GLOO, GLOO, these are organizations who are actually working to use information for an end that isn't necessarily good for everybody, right? So it's continuing to happen. But let's talk about some positive opportunities there. So around this same time, only, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, nobody in the United States really was eating kale. So if you were live in front of me today, I would ask hands, how many of you have eaten kale recently? Almost all the hands will go up, right? And then I would say, do you know who the biggest buyer of kale was 7 years ago? The answer is Pizza Hut. And it wasn't for eating, it was for putting on the ice around the food that's on the salad bar. Nobody was eating kale. But at that time, the Kale Growers Association was formed. It had a membership of one, which was this PR firm. They said, let's make a market for kale the way we made a market for avocados in the 80s or other sorts of products. So it starts with identifying groups of people, and it's so much easier today. Just like Cambridge Analytica did in 2016, you use that information from social media and elsewhere, you model the people and you say, well, this group of people, it's going to be too expensive to move them. I'm not going to make a Democrat or Republican with a worded email. It's going to take a big investment in a campaign to move them. But there's a bunch of people here in the middle kind of vacillating. They haven't really entrenched on either side of an issue. So I can identify who they are, and then I can start figuring out, where do they get their information? Who are their major influencers? Let me create a campaign of micro agreements that starts with, iceberg lettuce is what you eat every day, but darker green vegetables are slightly better for you. And if you get that, then you can move to the next thing that says, kale is a dark green vegetable, but it doesn't taste very good. But oh, look, here's Rachel Ray with a recipe for how to make it taste good. Oh, and look, some of the people you like Gwyneth Paltrow and whoever else is up there, have written cookbooks around it, and they're going on talk shows talking about the health benefits of eating kale and how to prepare it properly. Next thing you know, in a short amount of time, we're all going into restaurants, seeing kale on the menu at 15. It happened in a really short amount of time. And it really starts with, again, identifying people, trying to move them. And maybe if there are competing messages out there, you have to overwhelm that competing message with stronger narratives backed up by influencers in the channels of the people you're trying to reach. And we've shown over and over again, if you invest that way, you can actually figure out how much of an investment you have to make, how many messages it's going to take, and how you move someone to that new position. That's and that's whether it's Coke and Pepsi. Here's an example of, a messaging campaign where I can edit each one of these messages. I can put them into SIM, and I've got 50 groups of people represented here, and I can like this war between Pepsi and Coke, where I can drill down into saying who's this person or this group of people that I've modeled? How finely do I need to tune my number of personas? And this is what always struck me when I looked at marketing folks, is typically you would talk to even a major brand and they would have 4 or 5 or 6 segmentation models that represent everybody in the country or everybody in the world. And our first reaction, given our experience in Afghanistan and elsewhere, was, why don't you have 126 million? Well, it turns out there are not 126 million meaningfully different ways to choose between Pepsi and Coke, right? Or chicken or canned tuna, but it's not 5. So it may be 50, it may be 20, it may be 30. We see different results depending on what the question is. It's not always just Democrat versus Republican or binary. Usually there's a lot of shades of gray or points of view in between that you can model. And you can decide, or sometimes the data will tell you how many of these models I need to have to get to something that's meaningful for my problem. But again, we can show how we do that. Now let's look at one of the issues of today. Is COVID a hoax? Is asking me to wear a mask and socially distance, is that an infringement of my freedom? Or is it something that only every responsible citizen should do in order to reduce the impact of this pandemic? Because the pandemic is real, people are actually getting sick, people are actually are dying. What does the evidence say? Well, that's a competing narrative. This is information warfare. And if you let the competitive message run without any counter narrative, then you're going to get bad results, and that's what we've seen. But if you have a competing narrative that has the message of you should stay at home, just do it for a little while, and we're all going to be better. Here's the data behind it. Here's actually what we need you to do, and you send it through the proper channel so it reaches the person first of all, and secondly, make sure if you can have influencers behind it, it actually accelerates it. I'm going to jump out quickly and just show a little example of what it looks like. All right, so this is some other stuff we're doing around COVID, but here's a simulation where I'm just going to run it. I've got 10 types of people here. Here's 1,000 people represented by these 10. And here's a bunch of data about what the implications are of their activity. So I can change, the capacity of care, how many beds per 1,000 do I have, what's my infection rate. You can play with all that stuff. But this is where it gets interesting. If I only have this counter narrative that you don't have to wear masks or stay at home, and if I also add influencers to it, you can see that certain people are affected more than others and will actually get to the point where their probability of going about their lives without taking measures of safety increases rapidly the more they hear this message and they don't hear any kind of compete. But counter it with Oprah, it's going to move most people will listen to Oprah, we found. But that guy really listened to Oprah. We can actually show what the alternative is, and I can render this down into activity probability prediction, look at a variety of information about how many people are going to get infected, how many people are going to die, what's my chances of having a better outcome. But it starts with the data and with doing these models. And this can be applied just to regular healthy, how do I manage the health of a population of people and get all the way down to, here's your body, here's the physiome of you, here's the physiological model of you, here are the decisions you've made today about diet, exercise, weight management, and here's the sort of health history of your family, your genealogical information, and I can actually use that to predict and show you directly what kind of implications the choices you're making, where you live, the activity you do, and how likely it is that you're going to be able to see your grandchildren. So that's the positive aspect of all the technologies we're talking about today. So that's really what I wanted to provoke you with today. And I look forward to talking with any of you who should be in the chat session afterwards. I do expect it's going to be a rich conversation. Here's some additional reading if you'd like to do it. Lots of interesting technologies converging very quickly in this space. It's moving fast. We're not going to put the social media genie back in the bottle. So the data that we're leaving out there is going to persist. If you're really interested in that issue of what we were trying to do with the internet and the positive, please read Doc Searls' book, The Intention Economy, over here on the right. That is an extension of the Clue Train Manifesto, which first came out in 1993 when the graphical internet was born by David Weinberger, Doc Searls, and others, where we said, hey, finally, we're going to really do some positive. We're not going to just have 3 or 4 channels of information being broadcast to us and controlling us. We're going to have this freedom to control our own future, and we're going to empower individuals. What we're seeing, of course, today is the negative side of empowered individuals who think their opinion matters just as much as someone with 50,000 hours of expertise in a field, and that's a problem we have to deal with. So I think I've done a reasonably good job of laying out some of the problems, a few of the opportunities, and I look forward to carrying on the conversation with any of you who are interested. So please connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. By the way, I'm like one of the first 1,000 users of LinkedIn. Reid Hoffman was an investor in my last companies, like that platform, but hopefully platforms for good and optimize all the outcomes for our near future. Thank you all for attending.